Hello and welcome to the Proceedings of the Philosophy Book Club. The Philosophy Book Club is a small but dedicated group of former and current students who meet fortnightly to discuss issues in and around philosophy. We disseminate materials on a particular topic and meet on a Sunday to discuss and debate the issues raised. On occasion, when we're fortunate enough, we are also joined by an academic who speaks to us on their area of research to help guide our discussions. If you're interested in joining the Philosophy Book Club, or you're an academic who would like the opportunity to share your research to a small but inquisitive group of students, please contact us using the details in the description below. This week, we were joined by Jonathan Wolff. Joe is the Alfred Landecker Professor of Values and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford. Before that, Joe was the Dean of Arts and Humanities at University College London. He spoke to us on the intersections between philosophy and public policy.
So, thank you for having me to your book club, and I'm not going to talk for very long because I think I will find it by now a slightly alienating experience of just talking into a screen and seeing yourself on the picture. So we said 30 minutes. I might not take that long. On the other hand, when I get going, as some of you know, it's quite hard to stop me. So we'll see what this actually means in practice. Okay. So the book Ethics and Public Policy. So it came about in a strange way, I suppose, because I had been involved over a period of about 10 years in a number of different public policy committees. And when I started doing this, it was a bit of a different world academically. So now, if you do anything related to public policy or related to the government, the department gets terribly excited because they need this for their ref impact statements. And so if you do something like that, it's very highly validated academically. But when I started doing this, which was 20 years ago, starting public policy work, I almost hid it from my colleagues because it wasn't a sort of serious academic enterprise. And the first thing I did, which I'll talk about, was a report on gambling law. And I didn't even put it on my CV. So it was a co-authored report of about 10 authors or roundabout. And it did have an effect. It did bring about some changes to UK gambling law, some good, some not so good, which we might talk about as well if anyone's interested in that topic. But what happened was that I just got a phone call asking if I would be interested in being on a review of gambling law. And there were a couple of reasons why the government wanted to review gambling law. So the first was broadband was not yet in. So none of you probably are old enough to know the pre-broadband world, but we used to have to get onto the internet at home. You used to use a dial-up service through your telephone line, and you would pay by the minute for it. And so no one would want to spend very long online. You'd go. It was like making a phone call before you had unlimited calling. So you'd go online, try and get what you needed in just a few minutes, and come off again. So unless you were very rich or someone else was paying, you spent almost no time on the internet at home, although at work you may well have had a permanent connection. But broadband was coming in, and it was predicted, sensibly enough, that broadband was very likely to lead to much more gambling opportunities on the internet. It was already possible to use your mobile phone to gamble, but you'd have to make a call. Something called WAP had just come in, Wireless Application Protocol, which was a pre-runner of the smartphone, but it was terrible, and it was more or less unusable. But the smartphone and broadband was coming in, and so then for the first question was, how do you regulate this internet space that doesn't obey national borders? So what can you do about having a regulated gambling environment online? So that was one question we were asked to look at. And the other thing was around competition policy, interestingly enough. So again, before the law changed, it was illegal to advertise gambling in the UK. Casinos could not even have a sign outside saying casino. So how did you know that there was a casino there? Well, you weren't really encouraged to go. That you could ask a taxi driver, and a taxi driver might take you to a casino. But then when you got there, you couldn't just walk in. You had to join. You had to be a member. And it would take 24 hours for the application to be processed. So you couldn't just go into a casino on a whim. You had to make an application. And I found out, before I did this, I found out the same thing was true about bingo. So I lived in Kennington. There was a bingo hall around the corner from me. One night, my friends and I thought, wouldn't it be fun to go and play bingo? So we went round to the bingo hall, and they said, you have to be a member to play. So we said, fine, we'll be members. And they said, but it takes 24 hours to process your membership. And we started explaining what a terrible business model this was. And they just said, no, that's the law. If you want to play bingo and you're not already a member of this club, then we have to take 24 hours to process your application. And that was so that you made a properly mature decision to go and play bingo rather than just coming off the streets. I mean, you could go to a bookie and place a bet. You didn't have to be a member to place a bet at a bookie, but the bingo or casino you did. And the reason for this, it was very interesting. We can talk about the history of it if you want to, but the point was that there was a concept called unstimulated demand, which meant that gambling facilities could cater or pander to gambling demand, but they weren't allowed to create it. They weren't meant to be creating demand, but if there was demand there, they could show there was demand there, they could offer services. But the National Lottery had come in, and the National Lottery was advertising on primetime TV. And so the gambling industry was saying the government is breaking its own laws. This is unfair competition. And they were threatening to complain to the EU competition authorities. And so instead of allowing that complaint to go through, the government instead had what they called a gambling review body. It was like a royal commission, except it wasn't given that name. It wasn't so grand, but it was a review body of gambling law. And we were meant to deal with these two problems. Now, before I get into the detail of that, if people want to talk about it, I think it's worth saying something about what was going through my head when I had this conversation. So, I spoke to them on the phone, and they explained carefully about gambling law review, why it was wanted, and then, of course, as soon as they asked me if I was interested, I was going to say yes. But I had to sort of play hard to get a little bit. So I said, well, what would it involve? And they said that there would be the civil servants who would draft the report. In fact, the civil servants didn't, and a small number of us ended up drafting the report. And they said, but it would also involve about a dozen visits to gambling establishments like racetracks and dog tracks and so on. So I just thought this would be fun to do, part of my working life, to go to a dog track. So I did. So I signed up for it. But in my head, when I was thinking about this, I was thinking, well, this sounds like a lot of fun, and it's going to be quite easy to do this. It's going to be quite easy to do a review of gambling law, because by that time I'd been teaching for about 15 years or something, and every year I'd been teaching John Stuart Mill on liberty, and I thought that the only reason for limiting the liberty of any person was to prevent harm to others, and preventing harm to that own person was not a good reason for government interference. So I thought I believed that. So I thought, this is going to be easy. We just apply John Stuart Mill's harm principle, and we work out gambling law from that. Well, luckily, I never said that out loud. I've only said it to philosophers, because if you think, what would that mean in practice? Right? You can't protect people from harming themselves. So so here's a possible product that is not legal in the UK. A slot machine where you put in your credit card and you carry on playing until you've reached your credit limit. Okay, that is illegal in the UK. You can't have a machine like that. Why not? Well, is it because if I spend all my money and go up to my credit limit, I'm harming other people? I might be, but then that's an argument against credit cards. That's not an argument against gambling. That's an argument against having any opportunity to spend more than I have, or to spend everything. The reason we do it is that gambling is addictive. It's strongly addictive for some, mildly for others. And we want to make sure that people don't get sucked in further than they have the capability to pay for, or at least within the decisions they're making. So most of the, I'm not exactly sure what the law is at the moment, but for a long time it's been illegal to take credit card payments for gambling. You can take debit card, you can take cash and debit card, and who's going to argue against that? Right? Who's going to argue against those laws? So obviously there's a paternalistic element to regulation, and that's a bit concerning, because as philosophers we were meant to be against paternalism. But then when you start looking at the laws, there are many that are paternalistic. So you see politicians, I remember David Cameron, whenever it was handy, he appealed to John Stuart Mill on liberty. But of course, no politician actually believes it. They might use it to support a program, but seatbelts in cars, crash helmets, campaigns about public health, we spend absolute fortune telling people how to look after themselves. So we have a huge amount of paternalistic legislation. So what I realized, and it took me a long time to formulate it properly, but what I realized is that there's a story we sometimes tell ourselves about how to connect philosophy and policy, which is not true. So the story that we tell ourselves is, first of all, you develop your philosophical theory. Might be utilitarianism, might be middle on liberty, might be human rights theory. First of all, you develop that. Then you go out into the world and you apply those theories to problems in the world. And we even encourage that with the name Applied Philosophy. We've got the Journal of Applied Philosophy. So it sounds like we know what our philosophy is. We see a problem in the world, we apply that philosophy to the problem, and we work out an answer. So what I realized during the course of the time when I was doing this work is that this is not a sensible way of connecting philosophy and public policy, and we need to think about other ways. In a way, it was interesting for me that I wrote the first edition of the book without really formulating these methodological reflections. And it was only when a friend of mine was desperate for a chapter in a volume she was editing that someone else had dropped out, and said, could you come up with a chapter on methodology? I said, well, I hate talking about methodology, I don't really want to, but you're in a desperate situation, so I'll do something. So just in a couple of weeks, I wrote a paper explaining what I regard as two different ways of trying to connect philosophy and public policy. So one is the applied method, where you begin with a theory and then try to apply it. And I think there are lots of reasons why that goes wrong. And there's another method, which I call the engaged method, which I think is the method we actually use, most of us use, which is you start with a problem and you start thinking, why is this a problem? Why are people concerned about this today? So in the question of gambling, if people were concerned with the question of how do you balance individual liberty for people to do what they want with paternalistic conceptions to stop vulnerable people harming themselves. So how do we balance liberty of the individual with protection from harm? That was the main issue. There are other issues around fairness to the punter and keeping crime out of gambling. So how do we make sure that the products are fair? How do we keep crime out? Those were problems that could be there on other occasions, but they were not the main problems we were looking at. And in fact, when we took evidence, a lot of people thought the main issue was children gambling. So one of the things about the UK is that, as far as I know, it's the only country with a developed gambling infrastructure where it's legal for kids of any age to gamble. So you may not realize this, but in the UK, you can gamble at any age. You can't gamble on everything. You can't go into a casino. You can't gamble at the bookies. But if you have had a British seaside holiday, you will have gone onto the piers, and there are 3 types of gambling opportunities for babes in arms. Okay, they might not be very good at them. But one of them is the low stakes slot machine. So the slot machines which just take a few pence and give them back. So low stakes slot machines, anyone can gamble. Also what's known as the pusher or penny falls machines, where this is very popular with kids, where you roll a tuppence or down a slot and try and get the timing right so it knocks off other pennies, tuppences, and they come down and you collect them. So why is this a gambling machine? Well, if you look carefully, the money is falling off the sides as you go. So that never comes back as prize money. So something like 5 or 10% of all the money that's put in just goes to the operators. But when I talked to an operator, what's the payout? He said, well, in theory, it's 95%. So if you put in £1, you should get 95 pence back. In practice, it's 0, because kids just see how long they can make their money last. So it's treated much more like a video game, where you try to see how long you can play for, rather than thinking you might walk away with some money. But technically, it's a gambling game. Then the other gambling game, I don't know, someone's put something in the chat. Arcades was the first introduction I had to gambling, started crying when I lost all my money and no one gave me anything. The penny pusher, well, the penny pusher doesn't have to be rigged because it just makes money. But the thing that people don't understand is the crane. So you put in a bit more money, 50p or something, and you try a game of skill to pick up a furry toy that no one in the right mind would want anyway. But for some reason, people put their money in, and the thing comes down, you try to grip it and pull it up. Right? Okay, so it looks like a game of skill, but it's actually a gambling game, because there's a random grip. So of course you have to maneuver it correctly to have any chance at all. But even if you do everything right, you could pull up the toy and then it just goes like that and drops it sometimes, or it won't grip in the first place. So you have to get everything right to have any chance. But even if you do everything right, even if you've got all the skills, you won't necessarily win because of the random grip. So people think it's rigged or something, but it's just a gambling game. So you think it's magnetized. Someone, Adib has said that's a penny. Yeah, I mean, I think these things are regulated. And so if they're not paying out 95%, then the operators are breaking the law, but maybe they are. Now, the thing about the crane, that no one thinks of the crane as a gambling game. It just feels like a game of skill. So any kid can play these, right? And we were lobbied by quite a few people who said that the age of gambling ought to be increased to 18 in the UK because of childhood gambling. But we got the same letter from about 25 seaside MPs when we asked for evidence. It was obviously written by a lobby group who said that if we made gambling on these machines illegal for under 18s, that would kill the British seaside holiday. And British seaside holiday was under threat anyway, and that these machines did no harm. Kids were gambling with their parents, and they use this expression, I think, add spice to a bit of fun. This is what those gambling machines do. So it's all harmless stuff. Then we had academics who were writing saying, this is what the lobbyists will tell you, but something like 15% of all kids live in the seaside, so it's not only for holidays. And these are areas of great deprivation and areas of temptation for kids. And so if you take a place like Blackpool, it's a highly deprived area to begin with, and then the kids will be corrupted by the gambling opportunities there. So we have these things to balance about individual fun, individual liberty, and harm to vulnerable people. So we could have said, well, let's apply a human rights framework. Well, that wouldn't have got us anywhere. Let's apply utilitarianism. Let's try to maximize the happiness for the greatest number. But we all know the problems with utilitarianism, that it allows harm for some, serious harm for some, for trivial benefits for others. So you might say, are the benefits of gambling enough to justify what happens in the worst case? So opponents of gambling, I'm sure you've seen this, will point out people who get addicted to gambling, who quite often steal significant amounts of money, lose their marriage, go to prison, worst case, suicide. So we do see, I definitely wouldn't want to minimize this. We do definitely see gambling related suicides. So how do we deal with that? Some people say we should ban gambling. Well, my reply to that is that's where we started from. That is, we did ban gambling, or most gambling, in the 1950s. And the result of that was we had a proliferation of illegal gambling in the UK. And so gambling legislation came about to regularize and regulate what was already illegal and very harmful gambling. So it's quite interesting. One of our instincts as philosophers is to, if we see a social problem, to think there should be a law against it. Well, quite often there already is a law against it, and the law isn't working, or the law makes things worse. So we need to think about the harms that laws can do and non-observance of laws as well. Okay, so I've ended up talking about gambling, which, as you can tell, is a subject I love talking about. And but the same sorts of things apply in other areas. What I would suggest is the way I now think of the way of how to connect philosophy and public policy is not to say, I've got this great theory, let's use this theory and apply it elsewhere. Instead, I say, well, what is the problem? Why are people worried about this now? What are the values in play now? And can we understand the concerns of people? So there's a genuine concern about children getting addicted to gambling. But there's also a genuine concern about the decline of the local economy in the depressed seaside areas. So then this says, well, is there another way of dealing with this? Could we maybe just have better rules about not allowing children to gamble during school hours, for example, as has happened now? So the arcades have got a voluntary code that during school hours children aren't allowed to gamble, and they can have their own voluntary code about who they allow in without necessarily changing the law. So are there other ways of getting people what they need without having very heavy duty changes? Okay, so there's a lot more we can say. If you've looked at the book, you'll see gambling is one of about 14 different topics I discuss. So I'm very happy to carry on talking about this, answering your questions, or answering questions on any of the other topics that you'd like to, or related issues. So I think I'll just stop now and see what you would like to say. So thanks very much for listening.
Brilliant, thank you very much, and we'll give a little virtual round of applause. So thank you very much. So I'll open up the floor. Does anybody have any particular questions or areas that they'd like to discuss? Go ahead, Ojay.
Yeah, I've got. Cheers, thanks, Joe. I think one of my first questions is when thinking about starting from the problem versus starting from the theory, how different would you say it is from Amartya Sen's approach that you mentioned in the paper? I'm just wondering, do you think this is a development on his style of political philosophy, or would you say this is different? Because I am just thinking about, I do think that some of the steps you mentioned within the methodology are valuable progressions on what Amartya Sen may have been doing while he's doing philosophy. I'm just wondering where you see this fitting in this style of approaching problems in the real world.
So I think this is very important. So I should make clear, I'm not claiming to have invented a new methodology here. I'm not saying everyone was doing it wrong before me. What I'm saying is that people have already been doing what I'm saying, but they haven't necessarily formulated in the way that I'm encouraging them. So I think people haven't been as reflective on their own methodology as they might have been. I think this is, yourself, one of the bizarre things about philosophy is we pretend that we don't have a methodology, that we sort of pretend that anything goes. All you have to do is think hard. And methodologies are prejudicial or something. That's for scientists to have a methodology. And we're just these free thinkers, so we just use our brains to get results, right? And so as a result, we are using methodologies without acknowledging them and without being reflective about them. So there's a type of lack of reflection about methodology. I mean, of course, people talk about logic, and there's a lot of theory about logic. There's not a lot of theory about how do we use philosophical reasoning. So I would say Sen is doing, in part, he's doing what I'm doing. It's interesting to think about Sen because he also has a capability theory. And so he has produced the theory, but at the same time, he's not dogmatic about it. So he doesn't say, we should use capability theory and throw everything else away. So he'll also talk about human rights. He'll also even talk about general happiness and the general good. So he's using capability theory as one very large tool in his toolbox. But, I was reading Karl Popper this week. So Karl Popper, actually, Zan, you're at the LSE, aren't you? So Karl Popper, who is a very big name at the LSE. And so when I was an undergraduate, there was sort of LSE versus the rest of the University of London rivalry in philosophy. And Popper was responsible for that. Popper pulled the LSE out of the University of London BA. And so all the other colleges sort of ganged up on Popper. And we treated him as a type of bogey figure. And I never studied him as an undergraduate. But I've just been reading him, and he has this famous distinction between what he calls social engineering and piecemeal social engineering. I think that's a strange contrast, but he has this idea of sort of in political philosophy particularly, this idea that there's utopians, that the Marxists and also the fascists, he was writing in the Forces, thought they could refashion society according to a blueprint. And then there are others like him who thinks we should make small changes, changes that we can measure the difference they make. If it goes wrong, it's reversible and so on. We should do this much more incremental change. So again, he's much more like the engaged approach rather than the applied approach. So he doesn't start with the theory, he starts with the problem and thinks, what can we do to make things better? And you just see that everywhere. So if I give this talk in the US, people say to me, well, isn't this just John Dewey? And I have to say, well, maybe it is. And that reminds me, I keep meaning to read some Dewey to see if my view is the same as his. So I do think, and you're right, now you mention it, in the idea of justice, Sen talks about these two different approaches to political philosophy. One he calls a transcendental approach, and the other is a comparative approach. And it's really fascinating who's in which. So the transcendental approach has got Plato, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. The comparative has Machiavelli, Burke, Paine. All these people we didn't actually have on our syllabus in a philosophy department. So philosophy departments tend to study the transcendental figures, people with the big theories of justice. Whereas if you study political philosophy in a politics department, you're much more likely to be looking at these other figures who are much more delve into the problems of their day and try to work out solutions for those problems, rather than thinking they've got a vision that's going to solve everything. So long answers to the question. The short version of the answer is just yes. I think I'm pretty much doing the same as Sen and many other people as well.
Yes, thank you. I have one more question, then I'll stop talking. And this is about the role of the philosopher in formulating the problem. Because if we're thinking about starting from the problem and moving that way, one of the questions that comes to mind is when you think, all right, what is the problem? How do you formulate the problem in a way that's precise enough to be meaningful, but not so precise that I don't know, you're like looking at a very specific area, like for example in Blackpool. So I wonder, and because policy impacts non-philosophers far more than it does philosophers, simply by numbers, how much of a role do you think the philosopher plays in formulating the problem and trying to think what is the question that we're trying to answer? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think there are different cases. Right? So one case that left a big impression on me is what Dworkin has to say about the debate around abortion in his book Life's Dominion. And he's commenting particularly on the American debate, but it's the same probably all around the world, where he points out in the US there are these two camps. One is pro-life and the other is pro-choice. And yeah, that's great for a t-shirt, it's great for a badge. But he says, what does this mean, right? So is it pro-choice against anti-choice? Is it pro-life against anti-life? What is this debate? Is it that one side thinks that a woman has an absolute right to choose, and the other side thinks a baby has an absolute right to life? And Dworkin says, well, if you put it like that, actually, and you think what other things people believe, it doesn't correctly describe the debate as it is by thinking just in terms of pro-life and pro-choice. Because he says, if you think about the pro-choice side, almost everyone in the pro-choice side says that there's a limit beyond which pregnancy shouldn't be terminated unless there are real emergency reasons. So a late pregnancy just because a woman has changed her mind is not permitted, even by people who are pro-choice. Similarly, for people who are pro-life, so some people are absolutely pro-life to the point that if the mother dies, if the mother's life is threatened, that's still not a reason for an abortion. But most people say that if the mother's life or health is seriously threatened, that is a sufficient justification for abortion. So what Dworkin says is actually both sides value the same things. Both sides value the life of the child and the interests of the mother. What they do is balance those in different ways. They balance the interests in a different way. So it's not in the end a question of the most fundamental value. It's about what to do when the values come into conflict in a range of, quite a wide range of circumstances. So I found this quite a helpful way of thinking about it. I mean, unfortunately, it hasn't done anything at all to resolve the debate, or even change the public nature of the debate. But I think when we're getting underneath the debate, we can see, and we could, it would be a good service, I think, if people made these points more often. The debate isn't this absolute pro-choice versus absolute pro-life, but rather there are much more subtle things going on in this debate. And maybe there's room for, if not agreement, at least better understanding of the other's position. But there are lots of other cases. So one of the things that impresses me so much with Sen is this idea that the theorist's perception can name a problem and get us to see things in a new light. So where there's anxiety before, we can make some progress. So the famous examples around this are to do with feminist thought. And there's the amazing example of the invention of the concept of sexual harassment, which only, I believe, was coined for the first time in the 1970s. And it was because of a case where someone, I believe it was in Cornell Medical School, unfortunately, but a secretary in the department was coming under sexual pressure from one of the professors and found it so upsetting that she had to leave. And when she went to claim welfare benefits, they said, no, you lost your job voluntarily. You left your job voluntarily. And she was very upset, rightly, at this, because she didn't really think it was a voluntary leaving of the job. And she went to the law center. And they thought, well, we need to make a case that she didn't leave voluntarily. So we need a term for what she suffered. And after choosing a number of possibilities, came up with the term sexual harassment. And so then this created a precedent for others. So there you do have the theorist who's naming the problem. So the problem already exists, but there isn't recourse to dealing with it. And there's a fantastic passage. I can't remember whether it was in what I showed you, from Alison Jagger, who's a British feminist, socialist political philosopher who's worked in the United States. And she has this, so she's probably in her 70s now. And she said growing up, she felt a lot of unease, but she didn't have the vocabulary to describe it. And now she does. So now she has vocabulary like date rape, which she didn't have, or marital rape, or sexual harassment is another example, or the double day, or ageism, which you didn't even have the name of ageism when she was growing up, right? So all of these problems get named by theorists, probably not by philosophers, unfortunately, but by journalists and other social theorists. And we ought to, I think, be adding our name to these things, and it's increasingly happening. So naming or using concepts is very important for us, and also trying to dissect the problem. But you're also right that we need a lot of humility here, and we can't start off by thinking we know how to understand the problem better than other people. We understand how the problem should be framed, because we don't. Right? And so we have to work with communities if we can, or more likely we would work with activists who are working with communities. So we might be at arm's length. But I think in most areas of philosophy and public policy, you can't get anywhere sensible unless you're actually working with people outside the discipline. You can't do it by just by reading, for example. You need to be talking to people.
Brilliant, thanks, Joe. Any other people want to come in with a question? If not,
I mean, I've got one, but let's jump in. I was going to say, it's really interesting reading the paper. The first, and I mean this as entirely a joke, when I read this, Azan and I had discussed this when Azan was a very keen philosophy student at A-level. He was advocating philosopher king. That was his solution to everything. And this is what I thought when I read this paper. But on a more serious note, I was actually wondering what, and I think this is broader, what do you think is the role of philosophy in the UK? I mean, so my background is that I was born in Mauritius, connected to French culture. And in France, philosophy plays a huge part. In every debate, there's a politician, a philosopher, and someone from the field. And when I came back to England after studying in France, I thought there was a notable gap. And I was just wondering, did you feel that? Or have you felt that in your time?
Yeah.
That there's somewhat kind of a bias against philosophy here?
I mean, it is amazing how things have changed. I mean, I think, a lot of cultures, a lot of philosophers have France envy, with the idea of the public intellectual, and the philosopher being the public intellectual, and the rock star philosopher in France, which we don't have, but the US has UK envy. so the US thinks that in the UK philosophers play much more of a role, because people like Mary Warnock, who chaired committees, Honora O'Neill now, Raymond Plant, okay, he's a political theorist rather than a philosopher, but he's in the House of Lords. So we have people who've been academic philosophers who are part of that lawmaking community to some degree. In fact, there are 2 UCL former philosophy students in Parliament at the moment. So we do have some influence. Jessie Norman, who's in the cabinet, and Alison McGovern, who's a Labour MP in the North. Both were philosophy students. Both were my philosophy students, I think. I had no influence on Jessie's development, by the way. But things have definitely changed. So when I was young, Brian McGee had his Men of Ideas program. So there was philosophy on TV, and remember we were talking about probably only three channels. Now this is before Channel 4. So there's BBC One, BBC Two, and ITV. And late night you could turn on the TV, and Brian McGee would be interviewing Charles Taylor about Hegel on TV. And there was a book that went along with that series, and there were radio programs. Anthony Quinton was the chair of the Round Britain quiz. So this was amazing to have one of the most important philosophers in the country being a sort of quiz master on Radio 4. Before that, there was a program called the Brains Trust. I suppose the equivalent to it is the Moral Maze now. And we do have philosophers on as witnesses. I don't think there's ever been a philosopher who's been one of the sort of main panelists on the Moral Maze. They tend to be public controversialists more than academics. I mean, it goes in and out of fashion. There was a while when, if there was a philosopher on television, it would have most likely been A.C. Grayling. And then he got connected with Brexit, anti-Brexit campaigns, and the New College of the Humanities. For some reason, he's been less in the public eye. But you're absolutely right that philosophers are not playing those roles. The COVID crisis has made a bit of a difference, and that I see all around the world, philosophers have been asked to, or bioethicists anyway, have been asked to get onto sort of priority setting committees, and actually being asked their opinions about things. So although COVID has been horrible for lots of things, it's the sort of golden age of bioethicists at the moment. But I think they're definitely, you're right, there is that contrast. I don't really know what explains it. Germany is another interesting contrast as well. But their complaint is something a bit different. So I remember a few years ago talking to a German who said, for the whole of the history of philosophy since, I don't know, when you go back to Leibniz, there's been, Germans have been at the forefront of the development of philosophy. Who have we got now in Germany? Who's at the forefront? It's all in the United States, really, or France, if you're thinking in the way you are. Yeah, I don't know what explains it. It's very easy to say, well, it's just cultural difference. But what is it about the culture? I mean, do you have ideas? Do you have thoughts, having lived in both countries?
I mean, I guess the only difference I can cite is, and having spoken to those who studied the French back, for them, philosophy is compulsory up until age 18 for all leavers. I mean, they all sit the same exams. It's just depending on the track that they take at A-level, it gets given a greater weighting or lesser weighting. And it was quite interesting to hear that they have this broad exposure for such a long time. Whereas here, the number of institutions that offer philosophy at A-level is very limited. I mean, even then, I think, so I went to the same school as Azan, and I think it was mixed of theology and philosophy. Azan, correct me if I'm wrong here. Yeah.
Well, I was gonna input on that, which is that I suppose another part of the reason is because of kind of successive governments' kind of education policy, which is focused on trying to become competitive in the STEM areas. And trying to increase kind of international education scores which are competitive, and then that has favoured kind of the move towards the English baccalaureate, which kind of overweight subjects like kind of your sciences and maths, as opposed to the humanities. So that, over a number of years has had a contribution to that problem.
So I wonder about that. I mean, a few things there. So one is that if you think about the status of an engineer in the UK and in France, right? So in France, an engineer is a highly, it's like being a lawyer or a doctor if you're an engineer. So in much of the world, you have that status. And the French pride themselves on mathematics, or you say they used to, developments in science, and you've got Pasteur. So I think so I'd be reluctant to say that there's a sort of necessary trade-off between science and engineering and the humanities on the other hand. I mean, I think in France there's a validation of everything, of all intellectual culture, not just the STEM side. Going back to the baccalaureate, so in the distant past, I used to do undergraduate admissions at UCL. And if we go back far enough, we interviewed all shortlisted candidates. So some years I would be doing 100 interviews. And most years there would be some people who had taken the French bac or the international baccalaureate. And I would ask them what they had studied in philosophy, the philosophy part of the bac, and no one could ever tell me anything. So they didn't seem to study any philosophers on this. And they'd say, well, it was really just a discussion. So they were encouraged with this idea that they were studying philosophy, but they weren't able to say. Whereas if I asked an English person who'd been studying the A-level, I'd ask what they studied, and they would tell me that they were fascinated by the problem of evil or something, or they would tell me that they like, I mean, it was a bit of a shame because people would have just learnt that there are 4 proofs of the existence of God or something. I thought, well, that's interesting. Why would you say 4 proofs? They say, well, they're blah, 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 blah. And so their textbook has got 4 proofs of the existence of God in, right? And you would know the best objections to all 4 proofs. So that's how we studied philosophy in the UK. The exact opposite. Actually, there was this very, very simple content that you had to learn, whereas in France it was all amorphous and you couldn't really say anything about it. No.
Thanks, Joe. I actually had a question that I wanted to ask. A lot of the kind of movements I say recent, but it's been a while now, but kind of the policy processes around evidence-based or evidence-informed policy. And kind of given that position of, using evidence to inform policy recommendations, I know you kind of touched upon it in the reading, but where do you think is a specific way that philosophers can come in along that evidence-based process?
Yeah, I mean, so the evidence-based process is really fascinating, I think. And, there's a joke that you see in the civil service that politicians don't want evidence-based policy, they want policy-based evidence. And, I really saw this around the Brexit debate, where people who were trying to be sensible and evidence-based and think about the effects, particularly think about the effects of immigration on the economy and on wage rates. So the intuitive view is that low-skilled immigration reduces wage rates because there are more people competing for those jobs. But then there are studies that seem to suggest that it just isn't empirically true. But there are some studies that seem to suggest in some parts of the economy it is true. Right? So what you found was almost no one referring to both sets of studies. They were only citing the studies that supported their pre-existing position on the whole. I'm sure I did this too. So this type of confirmation bias, where you're looking for the evidence that already supports your position, that makes supposed evidence-based policy doubly problematic, because it's not evidence-based, but it's pretending to be. And so I think we can critique I mean, we're not the social scientists, so that there should be social scientists who are doing this by pointing out different studies and trying to think about what is the balance, what does the balance of evidence do. But I think I think we can try to support that effort by saying that there's no going. Well, and this relates to something the way philosophers tend to use studies in other areas. And again, I've done this myself. You want to be responsible, so suppose you're working on something about international trade. So you'll go to the journals and read a couple of articles about international trade. You think, okay, I know what to think now. But of course, no one in international trade would do that. No one in international trade would go to a random journal, pick 2 articles and think this tells me the truth. Just as if you want to think, what do philosophers think about the mind-body problem? And if you go to Mind and look at the last 2 papers on the mind-body problem, and think, okay, so now I know what philosophers think about the mind-body problem, we'd laugh at you, because all you're doing is skimming the surface and doing a sort of random sample, right? So I think, when you stray outside your own area, this is a real temptation to think you're doing some sort of cross interdisciplinary work where all you're doing is skimming or cherry picking. That's why I said we need to work with specialists in other areas rather than think we can do everything out of our own heads. But I think in the policy process, I've been involved a couple of times with economists in the civil service. And it's quite interesting to see how they view their role. So some of them have a view that they are just there to provide evidence, to look at the best evidence sources, and then they put it to the elected politicians to make the decisions, because and that's what democracy requires. It requires the elected politicians to make the value judgments on the basis of the evidence. They shouldn't ignore the evidence, but the evidence itself never determines a policy. You need evidence plus values to determine policy. Whereas other civil servants said, well, we're as qualified as politicians to talk about values too. So we should be making actual recommendations of policies based on the evidence and the values. What happens in practice is the values never really get talked about. And so some set of values is assumed, and without there being reflection on them. So in a way, my mission, I feel, I'm now in a school of public policy, and everyone there thinks that public policy should be informed by values, which is a start. But what this means in practice is they give, not everyone, 1 or 2 people I've seen, give the same lecture they would have done anyway, but just say values every now and again. Right? And I see this a lot. So in business schools, they say, we have to talk about values. So they just say values. Right? So what I'm trying to do is move down a level. Say, well, what are these values? Right? And the values are nothing fancy. They're things like public health, or civil liberties, or human rights, or general well-being, or equality, or liberty, or non-discrimination, or giving priority to the disadvantaged. So these are all values. And I think as philosophers, what we can help do is just bring those to the surface and show the trade-offs involved in policy decisions and who is going to be losing. And are we fine with civil liberties being reduced a little bit in the pandemic for the sake of public health? It seems like we are. But how long, what process, and do they affect different people differentially, and do they need to, and can we do things about that? So we can just carry on asking these micro questions about how policy affects different groups. Do they have to? In what ways do they affect them? Rather than saying, we've done the cost benefit analysis and the costs are relatively small in relation to the benefits, so we'll go ahead. So, well, are the costs fairly shared? Are the benefits fairly shared? Do the people who got the benefits last time still get the benefits this time, and the people who suffer the costs last time still get the costs this time? So we can ask those. I mean, it goes back to OJ's question, really, about who's formulating the questions and whose questions are they. I think there is a benefit of being almost Socratic and never giving up, asking questions about values, and trying to force people at least to understand the decisions they've made and the trade-offs they've made, and that it may be unfair to keep making the same trade-off to affect the same people. I mean, this is, you all know this, but what we've understood from the pandemic is that every fracture and fissure in society has been brought further apart. So, those people like me in a privileged position, I can do my work from home. I'm no longer commuting. I'm no longer paying my train fare. Got nothing much to spend my money on. It turns out I'm paying off my mortgage faster than I've ever done before. Whereas, okay, my son's not exactly an example of the most disadvantaged person, but he runs a bar and he's been furloughed, and he's working with people who have no other source of income than their wages. The furlough doesn't cover service charge. So people have been struggling to pay their rent, having to give up their accommodation and move back in with their parents because the furlough is not covering their rent, so on. So you're seeing where there was already inequality, that is just getting bigger and bigger now. And this is noted, and the government is occasionally trying to do something about it. But we need to keep hammering on about it, even if it's known. You still have to keep hammering on about it.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Joe. I think that probably brings us to the end of our time. So once again, thank you so much for joining us. I think I speak for everyone when we say that was really interesting and illuminating.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Thanks for staying with me. And I greatly enjoyed it, and enjoy the rest of the day.